Greetings from Lima, Peru. I'm traveling here with friends. And of course, being in a new place, I've never been to Peru, I had to make one of these videos, Gay Travel in Lima, Peru. Can you hear the birds in the background? It might be too faint to hear in this video, but if you can hear them, the birds here chirp differently, which is fascinating. They sound, I would say, more cheerful, which is a difference I also noticed when I first moved to Miami, that the birds sound different in Miami versus the Northeast. A little bit about Lima for some context. And yes, I'm in bed. I don't feel like getting out. You probably can't tell, maybe a little bit. I'm a little sunburnt here. So even though I got some sleep, I don't feel like leaving my bedroom for the next, my hotel room for the next hour or so. And I've been checking out the apps, as I do, and just contemplating and thinking about my experience here so far, and wanted to share some of these observations because I know you guys tend to like the travel videos. The gay travel videos I make people like to watch them, both subscribers and non-subscribers, because I think presumably it's some kind of insight that you wouldn't have unless you've been to that place, right? So for both people who are thinking about going there or who don't know if they'll ever get to whatever place, it gives you some context. So to start off, Lima, the capital of Peru, is very densely populated. So we met some locals here who were saying that a third of the population, the Peruvian population, lives in Lima. Think about how crazy that is. A third of the country's population lives in this one city. So that goes to tell you how densely populated it is, and how people really gravitate towards the urban area. And I think part of the reason there, which was also explained to us by locals, is that Peru is kind of divided into three vertical regions. There's the coastline, which is where Lima is. There's the mountains, the famous Andes Mountains, which in English, I think most people just call them the Andes Mountains, but this huge chain of mountains, and then the jungle. So very South American, right? The beach, the mountains, the jungle. But naturally, right, what's the easiest place out of those three terrains to build a city and for humans to live and thrive? The coastline, right? More stable terrain. So Lima is on the coastline, and a lot of other cities are on the coastline as well. So one thing that I'm really surprised by here, I knew this before, but it's one of those things where you have to see it to really understand it, to really see the extent of it. Peru is one of those rare countries in South America where the indigenous population, or whatever the politically correct term is nowadays, the native population, right, descendants of Incas, is much higher than most other South American countries. So all South American countries, really all American countries, all the countries of the Americas, right, North America, South America, Central America, these are all places where most people have immigrant roots, right? But there are some countries where the native population is still very, I wouldn't say dominant. They're still technically a smaller population than the majority. But Peru, Bolivia, and there's a few other countries, they are known for having a much higher percentage of the country's population being of native origin. So I did some research to figure out what that percentage actually looks like. Conflicting accounts. I saw somewhere it said 1 out of every 4 Peruvians is of native descent. And then I saw another one saying like 40%, which is obviously a huge difference, a quarter versus almost half of the population. It's hard to measure these things, especially when a lot of these indigenous communities live in the more rural areas, such as the mountains that I mentioned, right? Which I'm assuming are less accounted for than, for example, Lima, where a third of the population is, and it's so densely populated that it's much easier to measure these metrics, right? So I say all that to say, you really feel that here versus, for example, I mean, I haven't been to that many places in South America. I think the only other place I've been to in South America is Brazil. But walking around Brazil, you see, at least in Rio de Janeiro, you see that most people for sure are descendants of Spanish or Portuguese or some kind of European ancestry. Here, noticeable difference. I've never been to a place where the Native American population is so palpable and noticeable, and coming from the United States, where it's rare, it's so rare to see Native Americans, right? Really the only place where you might see several Native Americans would be like a reservation or a town near a Native American reservation out on the West Coast. But even those are like so limited and so rare. So for me, coming from a country that has a history of Native Americans, it's so interesting coming to a place where the preservation of that culture and heritage is so much stronger, which again, as I said, is actually rare in South America, but Peru is an exception. So of course, checking out the apps, Grindr, Tinder, Bumble, it's very much reflective of these demographics that I mentioned. And so I think that explains why, since I've gotten here, I've gotten a shitload of messages. And I'm not saying that to brag, I'm saying that never happens. The only time that's ever happened is when I went to the Middle East and Egypt in particular. It was insane how my phone kept blowing up. And that's been happening here too. And my Peruvian friend was like, don't you get it? It's because here you stick out because you don't look like the local community here. And this is something I've heard a few times before in the past. Like when I've mentioned this before on this channel, when I went to Dallas, Texas, and I met this guy who was Black, and he was like, here you're like exotic to us because there aren't that many Mediterranean guys in Texas, right? Texas is like very that white American Anglo-Saxon, or it's like Black American, or depending on which part of Texas, right? There's also a huge Mexican community. So that's really interesting to me, how it's not even just about physical attraction or like beauty, right? It's sometimes just being different, features wise, gets you this attention in different parts of the world. Like I find that as a phenomenon really interesting, how I guess it's true when people say opposites attract, that presumably a lot of people are attracted to what's considered exotic to them, like what is a novelty to them, which in some cases ends up being not so ideal, right? Because then you go into this whole fetishization thing, right? Where certain cultures, I mean, we know this, right? Like Asian women are very much fetishized. Black men are very much fetishized. So I'm like, am I being fetishized in Peru? I'm not mad at it. I'm not mad at it. It's nice to feel like, you know, people coming to you and then you can kind of sort through your inbox. But yeah, those are my observations so far. I'm with friends, so I don't know that I'll actually meet up with anybody. I'm here for my friend's birthday, so I feel like it wouldn't really be cool to be like, hey, tonight I'm gonna go hang out with some guy. But it is always still nice to see what's out there. Also, what's really bizarre is that when I opened Tinder here, it suddenly said all my matches would expire in 48 hours unless one of us communicated with each other, kind of like Bumble. If you're familiar with Bumble, when you first match with somebody on Bumble, you need to reach out in the first 24 hours. So I was like, oh, this must be a new feature with Tinder. But then it didn't say it for one guy who I know lives in Mexico. We had matched when he was visiting Miami. So I'm like, that's weird. Does he have like a paid account so his matches don't expire? Like, why would he be the anomaly? So I Googled it out of curiosity. I was like, is this a new rollout feature that Tinder's doing to compete with Bumble? Turns out, at least from a Reddit post, I love Reddit, this is a thing that happens when people come to Peru. Like there were all these comments that said, help, I've come to Peru and all my matches are expiring. Why is this happening? And Mexico. So there you go. For some reason, this affects Mexican and Peruvian users, or users in Mexico or in Peru differently, I guess. So I don't know if it's a bug, but like, what are the chances? Like, what is it about Peru and Mexico that this feature gets unlocked? So I thought that was funny. If you've been to Peru, let me know what you think in the comments. To be totally honest, I'm also only in Lima, right? So I can only speak on Lima, but so far, Lima's not my favorite kind of city. You know, a lot of places are like this. It's not that Lima's an exception by any means, but I'm always kind of like wary of places where there's a specific part that's much nicer and more developed and wealthier and safer as a result. But then like around that is rough. There's a lot of places like that around the world, right? When I went to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro, that's something I was warned about, right? That you have to be very careful which regions you walk into. And so when you go to places like that and it's in the back of your mind, it's not really a great headspace. But even just as a city, it's just not my favorite kind of city. For example, the temperature is amazing. It's pretty much great weather all year. I guess because we're closer to the equator, so it's more temperate, but it's cloudy all year. It doesn't rain much though, which is interesting. So it always looks like it's going to rain, but apparently it very rarely rains. But the overcasting is a consistent thing. And I guess I would pick that over traditional seasons, but I need sunlight. Like these are the moments where I realize how lucky I am to live in Miami, where there really is amazing weather all year. The summers are rough in terms of humidity in Miami, but a beautiful sunny day really can affect your mood. And we met a local here who was like, other than the temperature, the actual visual weather here is very much like London weather. Architecturally as well, Lima, it's like there's a lack of consistency, and I like architecture. I pay attention to these things when I travel. I like certain themes, like even living in Miami, I live in South Beach where Art Deco, there's a certain aesthetic that you see consistently, and it really does affect the character of a place. And at least where I am staying in Lima, which is this bougie place called Miraflores, it's like there's a house, and then next to it there's like a restaurant, and then a condo building, and there's like no cohesiveness. It's kind of like thrown together. I know some people love cities like that because it feels more like real and unpretentious, but I think for me, my favorite cities are always the ones where I'm inspired, and I don't think Lima is just my kind of city. Curious what you guys think. Let me know in the comments.